I teach science and critical thinking at a college, and every semester I start by telling them a story. In the 15th through the 17th centuries in Europe, belief in witchcraft was pretty widespread. Witches were accused of any number of terrible things, like casting spells and hexes to harm people, to consorting with the devil, to causing seizures, killing crops, manipulating the weather, and even killing people. What was their evidence? Well, there were things like witch marks, which were moles or birthmarks. The test that was considered infallible for hundreds of years was the swimming test. The idea was that witches hadn't been baptized, so that water wouldn't accept them. So they would throw the accused into the water. If they floated, they were a witch, and so then they were executed. If they sank, they weren't a witch. They had drowned, but they weren't a witch. But the absolute best evidence was confessing. And how did they get a witch to confess? They tortured them until they did. I won't go into all the gory details here, but let's just say humans are really inventive when it comes to finding ways to torture their fellow humans. And I can safely tell you that I would confess to anything to get the torture to stop. And a lot of people did, because they confessed to some pretty crazy things. As just one example, Walpurga Hausmanin in 1587 in Germany confessed to killing 40 children and 2 women in labor. She was then burned alive. And that was your fate once you confessed. You were executed. After I finish, I ask my students, why would I tell you this story in a science class? And the point is that critical thinking and evidence matter. By some estimates, up to 500,000 people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft during this period of time in Europe. So there can be real harm to believing things that aren't true. But there's more to it than that. My students generally don't believe in witchcraft, so they can look at this case and evaluate the evidence more objectively. They don't have skin in the game. If I started with something that they really cared about, then they might be triggered and not actually be able to think about the evidence. The people who thought witches were killing people were absolutely convinced that they were right. Their evidence wasn't as good as they thought it was, and my goal for my students is to internalize that process on their own beliefs.